This is Creating Your Encore Career and Becoming a Silver Entrepreneur with your host, Lynn Freest. Lynn will share ideas and expert advice from people that are walking in your shoes and living their encore careers, where they want and at the pace they want. You'll start a company of one with confidence and knowledge to live a fulfilled life of freedom and ease. Lynn is a coach and leadership consultant whose mission is to show senior leaders and experts how to start something refreshing and new after a full career in the corporate environment.
Welcome to this episode of the podcast, Creating Your Encore Career and Becoming a Silver Entrepreneur. This episode is number 104, and it's titled, Why Embodied Emotional Intelligence Will Help You Engage with Authority. Now, my goal in the podcast is to create a compelling future for yourself in an encore career, or as I like to say, become a silver entrepreneur. I will also share ideas on how companies connect with the talent that you will provide and create value for both you and the organization. I always encourage you to visit my website and download the summary at the bottom of the podcast episode and use that as a tool to capture notes as you explore the concepts in this episode. And if you are considering or starting an encore career, please take the self-assessment quiz to help you create some quick clarity around your possible choices. Well, today we're going to be talking with Michele Nevarez, CEO of Goleman EI. Now, I've worked with Michele for several years and became a certified meta-coach in emotional intelligence through her work and her company. It's been both an honor and a privilege to learn and work with Michele and the Goleman EI team. Michele and Goleman EI are committed to bring emotional intelligence to life by transforming theory into meaningful action. The pandemic has certainly created a unique set of circumstances, which is inviting each of us to examine how we've been living our lives. And as we attempt to strike a healthier balance between work and home, between our many responsibilities, and cultivating our own mental and physical well-being, increasing our skills and emotional intelligence will certainly help. Today, some of the questions we're going to talk with Michele about are, in an encore career, we no longer have positional authority, so we need to create authority in other ways. And emotional intelligence can certainly help with that. And there's just a general interest by many people to reinvent themselves or relaunch themselves, whether it be as an independent worker or continue in their existing career. Now, if you're an independent worker, you're going to try to improve your know, like, and trust factors. And emotional intelligence is a perfect place to start. And this particular program that Michele will be describing is an excellent one because it goes beyond simple awareness or the concepts of emotional intelligence to start creating action and new habits of thinking and action. So you'll really actually, as it's described, embody emotional intelligence. And the process for the course of journaling and coaching, and it's a process that any independent worker could use again to learn other schools. So it could help you leverage yourself in other ways after, getting some more skills in emotional intelligence. And as independent workers, we have to invest in a variety of things, whether it be websites, software, marketing. So this is not an unusual investment and can easily have a 10x payback for you. Michele and all the colleagues that I have been connected with are truly committed to helping people become their best and most effective selves. So on to the interview. Welcome, Michele. It's great to have you on the podcast. We'll start off by you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your journey.
Thank you, Lynn. Thanks, first of all, for having me on your podcast today. Really an honor to take this time and speak to your audience. So I'm Michele Nevarez. I'm the CEO of Goleman EI. I am a mom to 4 kids who are mostly grown. My youngest is 15, still in high school, and the others are getting there. In terms of my background, before starting Goleman EI, I worked predominantly within the field of HR across many different industries. And I started out in management consulting during the dot-com era, and then I moved to the investment management space. I sometimes joke that I had a knack for picking the industry that was going to go on its ear while I was in it. And I worked for a little while at Janus Capital Group and then American Funds, and transitioned in about 2009 to healthcare, right as Obamacare and the healthcare arena was changing pretty dramatically from what it had been in the years prior, even decades prior. I've done a stint in manufacturing. So I have that sort of, the reason I did that is because I wanted to learn about lean practices. And so I went to work for an operating company for Danaher. It was called Hawk. And They handle everything having to do with water filtration and measurement and such. And then I've done a little bit of government consulting. So I feel like I've kind of made my rounds in the corporate world and ultimately landed in this space of looking at where can we actualize our potential and the best versions of ourselves, and how do we navigate the complexities of our lives in a way where we can have maximal impact and agency in our own lives. And so that's really what's brought me to this field of work in emotional intelligence and trying to integrate the best of what we understand about neuroscience of perception into very practical applications that are useful and beneficial for our lives.
Yeah, and I've always been impressed with your programs because often when we talk about emotional intelligence or mindfulness, everybody starts talking about their 10-day retreats. In contrast, I believe in the training that you've supplied, we have the self-discoveries, which are journal prompts, things that you can consider and write about, as well as micro techniques. So for busy professionals, I've always thought this is a marvelous way to take what can be some people think totally all consuming and say, no, this is something you can do in a few minutes a day. It does take time and energy, but it can be done simply and quickly.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think those are the kinds of things that we all need. We need things that we can apply on the spot, in the moment, again and again, and that are straightforward enough that it's not that you have to go somewhere else to do it or to learn it, to your point. And so I think what is so accessible and amazing about this work is that if you just learn even a few of those micro techniques that you can use when you're having a tough conversation or when you're brainstorming with your team and trying to come up with a new idea to an impasse you might have, or bringing sort of fresh set of eyes, so to say, or whatever really life is presenting you in the moment, which we know is at least 100 different things in a day, and being able to navigate your own emotions and reactions in as skillful way as possible is really where I think the magic is at.
And in particular now for the audience I'm thinking of that have encore careers, these are people that a big part of what they'll have to transition to is a new mindsets, new habits of thinking and action. And I think, again, your programs are really designed to help us make that start.
Yes. I think that it starts with understanding what are the ways in which I'm habitually making sense of my experience? And so my own perceptions, my emotions. I don't know if that's a question we would naturally ask ourselves. I wonder what my habitual ways of processing reality are. But at a most fundamental level, that's what's occurring. It's how am I dealing with the variables of my own moment to moment experience, and where in those moments do I actually have some say in the process? And so if we look kind of at a fundamental level, what are those inflection points? A big one is your own awareness and the level of sort of conscious awareness that you bring to any given moment in your life. And then secondly, and you intimated this in terms of habits of mind and how are we making sense of our reality? There are ways in which we can start to observe what's happening under the hood, so to say, what's operative for me, the things that aren't so immediately obvious to me, but that are setting into motion a very profound trajectory on what my results are going to be, every single outcome I'm getting in my life, or the quality of my relationships. And so really what we aim to do with our learning approach and our programs, and really even the crux of the coaching model, which you know intimately because you went through the program as a meta coach, is looking at what am I doing again and again, or thinking, or what are those mindsets that are reoccurring? And what kind of energy am I bringing to a variety of situations that leads to certain outcomes? And is that even helpful? And is that even what I want? And what does it mean to be at my best in those situations?
Now, I know one personal example I had of that is one of the micro techniques was just asking you, notice where you're holding tension in your body. Okay. That's not a question I would normally ask myself, but it was very instructive over time that I started noticing, okay, I had tension in my shoulders sometimes, and then just think about why is that? And there was other things that helped us think through that. But again, it was those simple things. You just putting your attention on something you hadn't paid attention to, I'll say, in the past.
Exactly. And I think I have to apologize in advance because every Tuesday we have the lawn mowed. And so that might be happening right now. So I apologize in advance. It's perfect. This is exact example of what happens to us in our lives. And we didn't expect this or that. This idea that the thing we always have access to, but we forget because it's just so close, is our own awareness and how we place and hold our own attention. To your point, whether it's if we happen to notice, okay, how am I feeling in this moment? Or what is my reaction when I hear X, Y, or Z? Or even my reaction to my own perceptions, which is how it works, at least on a physiological basis. So it's finding out in those moments, if I just shift what I like to refer to as my perceptual stance, that is how I place and hold my attention or my awareness and what that yields. Those seemingly simple kinds of shifts can ultimately result in pretty profound differences in my experience right now. And in terms of even how I then interpret what I perceive to be happening and the mindset, as you mentioned earlier, that you bring to that, which is sort of, if I had to think of a metaphor, it's sort of like the flavor of your mind, or sort of what's that landscape or backdrop that is both valent and salient. It has those elements that we can tease out and start to notice the things that we didn't pay attention to before.
And that reminds me of an example a good friend and teacher gave me once. Said, think of your perception when two things happen. The first one is your child spills a glass of milk at the table, and one of your child's guests spills a glass of milk at the table. Your reaction is different, I bet. And then you have to start thinking about, why would that be?
I love it. What a good example. I thought you were going to say, if you spilled the milk, I'm like, that's true too. Because that used to happen regularly. Like I told you I have 4 kids. And when they were a lot littler, something got spilt always. But it wasn't always the kids spilling it. But it's a great point that you make, and point well taken, that these seeming nuances sometimes are the little difference that makes all the difference.
And I know you also, through GEI, have got this upcoming masterclass coming, and I think it's really an opportune time for it because, as I've probably mentioned earlier, is that with the pandemic, really all our habits of thinking and action have been disrupted or unfrozen at the very least. So all of a sudden, you can read about it everywhere that people are thinking about doing different things. This is the perfect example to say, okay, go through a class like this to actually pick a path for yourself.
Love it. No, it's so true. And thanks, Lynn, for mentioning, yes, we've just launched our first masterclass in this format, and it's called EI Masterclass, Embodied Emotional Intelligence. And we picked that title very intentionally because when we think about learning a new topic, it's not just the intellectual understanding of the topic, which is important. That's also a gateway. Our knowledge is a gateway to learning anything, but it's being able to translate the concepts and the kind of purely intellectual component of that into day-to-day actions, and how can I actually show up in my own life in such a way that I'm at my best, or I'm behaving slightly differently in relationship to my cues that I have in my environment. And so to your point, I don't know, I think everybody probably had slightly different circumstances, maybe even greatly different circumstances during this time. But many of us, myself included, we got to see on a more regular basis, what are those day-to-day habits? And it's almost like the tapes that play in your head versus like whether it's thought patterns or mindset, or even what are the actions that I take again and again and in certain sequences. And now that we're gaining a little bit of our freedom back, who knows for how long, but you see people very eager to break out of those norms. And the masterclass is an opportunity to pause and say, what did I learn? Where am I at right now in my life? When I think about the things that are most important to me, what gets me out of bed every day? Are those the same things that excited me or that I was passionate about even before the pandemic, or 5 years ago or 10 years ago? And how do those things align for me now? Are the things that give me joy and passion the same? Are they different? Have they shifted? And to what degree am I living in alignment with what matters most? So it's an opportunity, I think, to take a step back and evaluate not only what's important to you, but how you're doing relative to those things in your life. And usually for most of us, it's not just about what we're doing. It's about who we're doing it with, our colleagues and the people we're spending time with, whether it's our family or friends. And those relationships, we always have some kind of ripple effect or impact on the people we spend time with, and they have an impact on us. And so you'd mentioned before this format of journaling. And so what we have done in this masterclass is given people an opportunity on the one hand to learn about the concepts of emotional intelligence while experimenting and applying them in their own lives and really thinking about, how's this working for me? How are these different elements that matter greatly to whether it's my professional life, my personal life, or both? How's it looking? It's like doing a check-in, like a very meaningful check-in with oneself, retuning, realignment, and sort of coming out, hopefully the other side, having really investigated things quite intentionally.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've always enjoyed in your framework, Daniel's framework for emotional intelligence, that they had those 4 regions or domains where it's self-awareness, self-moderation, or, managing your own, and then the awareness of others, and then finally relationships. Those remain key to me, I think, in anybody's success. And then as I think of people who are launching an encore career or even trying to become more effective in their existing career, this idea of know, like, and trust. And these fit perfectly into that your programs will really help us, one, know ourselves, and then also, which helps us develop that like and trust with others.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's when we think about what is the foundation of trust, there are a lot of elements to it, but one of them is authenticity. People feel, is this person being authentic? And part of what it means to be authentic is to be aligned with oneself. What is important to me? And am I doing those things? And am I not just doing them? Am I living them? Am I reflecting them in my relationships and what I prioritize my time on? And I think it's that aligning to oneself that allows for that very human connection and bonds of trust. And then the other thing is, I think when we spend time with people who are genuinely operating within the nexus of who they are, there's a natural sort of synergy. And if we think about even just the work that, for example, Dr. Boyatzis has done in the space of resonance and dissonance, that's what we mean by resonance. It's, am I aligned, attuned, and renewed in such a way that I'm able to connect with those around me and people are able to connect with me in a positive way that has resonance, as opposed to the dissonance which occurs when we don't tend to the mothership, when we don't take care of ourselves and how we're moving through the world and what we're spending our time on. If we're constantly engaged in things that aren't that meaningful to us, or that become more like a duty, or maybe even aren't the things we enjoy any longer, people feel that from you. And like you said, I think it's a gift actually to be able to work with a coach and really have reflected back the things that you don't see about yourself. That, look, if they were obvious to us, we would have fixed them already by now. And if we could have done it on our own, again, none of us would have any work or growth left, but we all know that's not the case. And so I've always found it to be a really beautiful gift to work with a skilled coach who can help move the needle and stand in our court until we see those things about ourselves that we can then start to work from a place of our own strengths and agency. And you mentioned before the 4 domains, and the way the program is set up. Within the 6 weeks, we delve pretty deeply into what we think of as the foundational skills of emotional intelligence. And so we think, okay, those are the prerequisites to doing anything well, whether it's how we interface and relate to others, or work through conflict, or how we work with our team, how we work with our family, how we work with ourselves and our own mind ultimately.
Yeah. I really like to go back to the coaching piece, because that, I think, is something that really helps me as well as others go farther and faster. And it's not that at least in my experience with coaching people, I seldom ever gave them a solution. They always had to create it. So I didn't connect the dots for them, but I maybe gave them a couple new dots to look at.
Love that.
But giving that safe space for a leader or a person just to speak out loud, I think it really helps them sort through it. But then as a coach, you can ask a few things, like you said, raise visibility of something they might not be seeing. And it really helps you go farther and faster in my eyes.
I think so, Lynn. And that's probably from all the work that you've done over the years in the various capacities. So often we don't see the things about ourselves that are much easier to see about somebody else. And I think even just this being listened to and seen can be very healing in and of itself. There's this healing aspect to being heard and seen that I think a good coach has. You're demonstrating it in this call by listening to me and creating a forum and a space.
Yeah, it's just that it's been always remarkable. The other thing that in coaching that's interesting is that it's fundamentally different when I have a chance to speak out loud about something than when I just think about it. You would say, what's the difference? But there is something different about having a safe space to speak out loud.
It's so true. And you saying that makes me think about one of the things that's important to say about the coaching approach. And you'd mentioned the journal prompts. So in our program, we invite people going through the program to reflect on certain aspects of how they're making sense of their world. So we could just call them habits of mind. So things like your mindset and your attitude that you're bringing perhaps unconsciously. And so you have an opportunity to look at that and write about it. And it's not that, a person has to write a lot or that it has to be so time consuming. It really doesn't. You'd be surprised if you either put pen to physical paper or just type for even 3 to 5 minutes, how much can actually be shared. And so in our approach, as you know, the coach reads those journals real time and responds. And the reason for the power of this in this coaching model is not just the introspection, which we know is good, but it's being able to start to see the coach, to see the patterns that may be coming up again and again, and to be able to reflect those back to the client and say, I observed this in what you wrote. What are your thoughts? Or here's something I noticed. And just that very act of noticing what's coming up again and how the person is processing is in fact teaching the client how to do this for him or herself. So everybody would love to be coached forever. I know I would be, but at some point we have to be able to make our way. And so building sort of that internal toolkit, as it were, to notice, hey, I'm at this spot again that's all too familiar where I have a tendency to do X, Y, or Z. Yet I know from having explored it that the impact of that will be A, B, and C. And so how do I come up with strategies which a coach can be extraordinarily helpful to bounce ideas off of and see things in a different way than we see ourselves, to come up with those strategies for when this happens, and I see this kind of either external cue or even internal cue of how I'm feeling or what I'm sensing even in my body, that's my moment. That's my moment to maybe mix it up a little bit. And instead of doing that thing that I always do or scratching the itch in the same way that I scratch it, I could move in the direction of the other. I could do something that would reflect my values in a way that honors the relationship in a different way and therefore leads to a different set of outcomes.
Sure. It reminds me of, I think it's Viktor Frankl said that between the event and the response, there's a moment. And to the extent you can expand that moment or at least recognize it, you can make all the difference in the world for you.
I love it. Absolutely. And it's that space of, we were talking before about awareness itself. And when we are more familiar with how processing and the act of perceiving, which we know now more about from a neuroscience standpoint, is quite constructed, actually, that we are far more, have far greater responsibility in that process than we might imagine. But nonetheless, it's that familiarizing oneself with where you have agency, and in this case, where you place and hold your attention, or that pause before you then set into, sequence a set of actions that you'll either regret or that you could feel happy for. And so it's tough. Nobody's saying this is easy. It's ours to work with on a moment to moment basis. And so it's not as if we ever, I think, arrive as much as how do we arrive at the scene of our own lives on a moment to moment basis.
Yeah. And again, you also remind me, my experience in coaching, but just in helping other leaders, is leaders are often, they're the ones that are supposed to have the answers. And they're the ones that are supposed to point the direction and all that good things. And yet I know in working with leaders, often said, how can you maintain that curiosity? Recognizing that one, circumstances change and you quite likely won't know all the answers, but especially in today's world. And I think that, again, the class, the journaling, the coaching helps people keep that picture of curiosity. Even though they may be an expert in some fields, still maintaining some level of curiosity, I think, is very useful.
I totally agree. I think there is a saying, I don't really know if it's just a common adage or if it's actually attributed to someone. Sorry, I don't know. But this idea of in the mind of an expert, there are very few possibilities. Whereas if you bring this sense of, like you say, curiosity and kind of what I'll refer to as a beginner's mind, then there's just so much more to learn that we have to learn from each other. And I think that process, if you're a leader and you have a team, just to be on the receiving end as a team member of a leader being curious about your thoughts and ideas and what you have to bring to the equation changes the dynamic and the value proposition entirely, from being, like you say, where the leaders have to have all the answers, when really it's so much more organic than that. And having environments where everybody can bring their best thinking and ideas to the table creates for very different experience and atmosphere for the entire team, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And with this group of people who may be pursuing encore careers, they do need to hold on to their expertise and be confident in what they know. But on the flip side, they have to be very curious because they have to learn things like marketing and technology and things that they didn't worry about. Other people took care of those. And so I think, again, for those starting encore careers, you have to own your expertise, but hold that curiosity because you have to learn a lot too.
So true. And one thing along those lines, Lynn, is when somebody does have deep expertise in something, if you can maintain that curiosity, there are often very novel connections that can be made. I had mentioned before I was in manufacturing for a while, and I did that because I really wanted to learn about lean practices. I wanted to expand my own toolkit, as it were. Since that time, and I didn't mention this before, but I've written a book. It'll be out in the fall. And I've taken the opportunity, or the liberty, you might say, of using lean practices to work with the mind and with our habits and getting to root causes, as it were, of the internal conditions that give rise to our external habits. That's one example where if you can allow that creative element of where you do have expertise to interface with the places you don't, or new environments and contexts, which we find ourselves in at various points in our lives, either intentionally or by default, that creates in and of itself kind of a generative framework or appreciative framework that is very exciting. It's, I think, part of what it means to be human and the uniqueness of even just how the brain works.
Michele, thank you for mentioning your book. Could you maybe share a little bit more? I know it comes out in this fall. I think it's built around the 12 self-discoveries, but I'll let you fill us in a little there.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Yes, it's called Emotionally Intelligent Habits, a guide to accessing your full potential. And it will come out in November, I'm told, and is on pre-order. And essentially, it's the crystallization and expression of where my work has evolved to. And all of the years in corporate, 25 plus years in those different industries I mentioned, different capacities and functions, that was its own education. Each time you make a move, even within a company, is like a whole education. And then combining that with, in my case, background in Tibetan Buddhist philosophy and practice and contemplative practice for the past, I guess it's 28 years now. And then the work that we're doing in the space of emotional intelligence, and that this sort of the key piece that has fueled my work in this space and that I write about in the book is when it comes down to it, of all the things we could focus on developing, where do you start? And where do you gain the most leverage? Where is that sort of point where I have the greatest influence in my own life, irrespective of what's happening, whether somebody's mowing the lawn or whether the rug gets pulled out from under you in one or more ways in your work life, your personal life. And always in any given moment, being able to ask and answer that question of where do I have influence? And then based on that, how am I going to respond? And so for me, that has been the key question that's driven so much of my work and the book. You mentioned the 12 self-discoveries. And as you know, from having gone through the program, and anybody who would go through the masterclass would certainly see this as well. They're basically emerged, the 12 self-discoveries emerged from coaching people for so many years and seeing where they habitually get stuck. And so then I started to notice patterns of where do people get stuck? Doesn't matter what level of leadership, what career trajectory or function, any of that. I just saw patterns. And so those evolved into what have now become the 12 self-discoveries. And essentially what those are is they point towards, we could say, patterns of mind or habits of mind that could trip us up if we're not aware of them. And so when we don't notice them, they can act as obstacles. But when we're aware of how they're kind of operating within us, we can shift our relationship to how we perceive our own reality and how our mindset is going to behave no matter what the circumstances are, which is what we all, I think, aspire to. Nobody likes to be knocked off center. Nobody likes to have the rug ripped out. But when it does, how are you going to show up? And so this is the crux of what the 12 self-discoveries help with.
Yeah, one of them that, just as an example, one of them, what do you have influence over? I think that's always important, especially when we have a turbulent world around us. And maybe you could share a little bit about that one. What do you have influence over?
Sure. I've narrowed it in the book down to 3 things, Lynn. And this is just the best of my thinking. I'm certainly not saying it's the only view. It really isn't. But at a most fundamental level, we have influence over our own mind and our own awareness. And so being able to, in the moment, check in and just say, okay, where is my attention? What is the quality of what I'm bringing to this situation? And we forget that we even have awareness because we take it for granted. We are able to perceive things. We know things. We can comprehend. This is just a function of being alive. However, when we start to familiarize ourselves with all the different ways we can be aware and how we can shift our own perspective. For example, when we get really narrowed in on something or focused and it draws our attention away from it, it's like we're clinging to or our attention is narrowing. But if we also know that our awareness has the natural capacity to be wide open and spacious, then we can bring our own perspective to any situation that we find ourselves in where we might otherwise be quite narrowed in on. So let's say you are in a meeting and you have a point of view that's very different than maybe everybody else's or a particular team member. In that moment, it's easy to get really focused on this is my point of view. This is correct. They're wrong. They don't see, versus being able to adjust one's perception in the moment, which you can only do through your awareness. There's no other gateway to do that. And to be able to give space to the fact that, okay, there may be more than one way to do this, or somebody else's perspective may be the thing that allows us to arrive at a more efficient, effective, or even just different way of going about things that we hadn't imagined. And so when we think of what we have influence over at a fundamental level, this is what we fundamentally have access to, our own awareness. Within the context of emotional intelligence, we often talk about it as self-awareness. But honestly, self-awareness is just one way of being aware. And it's a very important way. But there are many other what I'll call perceptual stances that we can learn to embody and we can practice in the moment. And then second is reframing. And so if we look at how perception works in the brain, where our brain is proactively simulating and formulating what it thinks it's going to need to do to respond in the next moment, whatever that next moment is, whether it's climbing a mountain, going into a business meeting or a negotiation or a podcast or whatever it is, dinner with family. Our brain simulates and predicts what it thinks it's going to need to do in that situation. And it does so based on prior experiences and expectations, really, of what it expects to have happen. That is a pretty automatic process. We don't have a lot of conscious say, as it were, in that sort of curated portion of our perceptions. But we all have the capacity, once we realize, okay, this is what's happening, or I think this is what's happening, and we start to make sense of a situation, right? Let's say we walk into a meeting room or a family discussion and we feel the tension, or we know something's not quite right, or they're engaged in dialogue, and our brain immediately sets to making sense of what we perceive. And so that process of conscious sense making is something we do actually have influence on. We have to train in it. And it starts by noticing what are those variables, like I said, those go-to mental models and beliefs and mindsets that we kind of, with like a knee-jerk reaction, always go back to like a magnet, just out of habit. And then being able to see, do those serve me? Is that even helpful? And being able to then make a choice about how you're going to make sense of the variables of your own perceptions, including your relationships with key people in your life, or even just people you meet in the grocery market, how you'll behave in different scenarios. So at a most fundamental level, that is where we have our influence, and being able to practice enacting that is what gives us our agency. And so you mentioned before self-management as one of the domains of emotional intelligence. What I like to think of is, instead of having to behave ourselves into something all the time, how about we have agency? We have maximal agency at any given moment because we're consciously aware of what's happening and can be skillful in the moment.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, again, for people who are starting a career and going out to interact with new people all the time, this is exactly important, because you have to be able to, in a sense, listen and be present. And just as all these things you describe, you have to have your agency, but you also, part of that is understanding that you don't know these people very well.
Yeah, so true. And we find ourselves in new contexts, and many people are changing careers. And even maybe this is not even the first time they've changed their career. Maybe it's the how many ever times. So the context is changing. And to your point, when the context changes, then it's even more important in some ways, and sometimes even more difficult in those situations to find your footing, even just how am I doing with this new scenario? And yeah, I think life gives us so many opportunities, doesn't it, to try these things, and just trying to be human and learning to be human is quite a thing in and of itself.
Yeah, and our work together with Goleman EI and the EICC group, it's truly international. And so I know, again, I have not had a lot of international experience myself, but it's just been amazing to see the different frameworks, the different ways people approach things throughout the world. And yet, with an open mindset, I think we've all done quite well at navigating our way in the global village.
Totally agree. And we've learned a lot from each other. I mean, I think about some of the relationships that you've formed with folks who are in really different parts of the world, and how much we have really benefited from those relationships and learning from one another.
Yeah. So, well, I think the other thing I wanted to just share, that I know this course is an investment in three ways, really. It's an investment in money, but also time and attention, which are vital to people. But again, I would especially say that as Encore career people, we will have expenses in our business. This was simply one of them, I think a moderate one. But the other thing is, what you'll learn with your time and attention going through this course, I think, can really be carried forward into other things that you're going to need to learn. And maybe you've had experience where these same processes will help people going forward.
Yeah. And I think often when we think about investing in ourselves, we clam up a little, and we don't hesitate to go on vacation. We don't hesitate to lay down money for other types of things that maybe we found are more socially the norm. But what it really means to invest in oneself and what one gets in return. One's future self will definitely thank you. If your aim is to have agency, sort of maximal, influence over your own life, what does that cost? I would say that for what people are getting in this program, which is 6 weeks of one-on-one coaching, it's 2 journal prompts every week. It's the full kind of online training component that you have access to for a year to learn about the nuts and bolts of Daniel Goleman's model of emotional intelligence in the 4 domains that Lynn mentioned earlier, in a kind of a learn, apply, reflect format so that it's not just conceptual. And then in addition, I'll be giving 3 webinars that really delve into the latest neuroscience of perception and emotion based on my book. And that's a lot for 6 weeks to get. And I think sometimes the things that we feel, are we really worth it to invest in? Many of the people who are making career shifts or starting their own businesses, investing in your own development is key. It's like having the latest equipment when you do this or that, or the latest computer. Or before I was complimenting your microphone, like, wow, that I should look into that if I'm thinking about podcasting. So we wouldn't hesitate for those physical objects. So when we think about the intangible, I can't think of anything that is more impactful than having influence in your own life. What is that value? What would that mean to you?
Michele, I surely want to thank you today. This has been a great conversation. I think you've shared a lot of wonderful information from our audience. So again, much appreciation. And any final thoughts you'd like to share with us?
No, just thanks for having me. And I super appreciate it and appreciate all that you do, Lynn. And I'm really excited about your new venture and the group that you're supporting and working with. I think it's fantastic.
Great. Thank you, Michele.
Thank you so much.
Again, our thanks to Michele for sharing all the great ideas and helping, see how embodied emotional intelligence can impact the careers and the authority of people who are starting encore careers. As we talked about earlier, there are a lot of people, not only people interested in an encore career, but others who are thinking about reinventing themselves or relaunching themselves. So this has application to everybody. That idea of an independent worker, you want to develop a know, like, and trust. And a lot of that is fundamentally comes out of the skills of emotional intelligence. And then again, this is the kind of thing where a course like this is an investment of both money, time, and attention. But it can really 10x your career as you move forward and create that encore career that you want. So as always, at the end here, I encourage you to visit the websites. I have listed in the show notes the Goleman EI website, the EI Masterclass website, and the pre-order site for Michele's upcoming book. And as always, I encourage you to visit my website and download the summary at the bottom of the podcast episode to start your exploration of the ideas here. And if you're considering or starting an encore career, please take the self-assessment quiz to help you create some quick clarity around your possible choices for that career. So again, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.